The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine ochre powder that clung to the soul as much as the skin. It coated the unpainted planks of the First National Bank, muted the shine on the sheriff's tin star, and settled in the lines etched around Samuel Carter's eyes. He stood at the teller's window, his hat held respectfully in his calloused hands, the scent of stale paper and oiled metal filling his nostrils. The air was thick with the late afternoon heat, the lazy drone of a fly near the ceiling and the only sound breaking the silence. Samuel was a man carved from the land itself, all quiet angles and weathered resolve. At 56, his hair was more salt than pepper, and his broad shoulders were stooped not from age, but from the weight of a memory he carried every waking moment. He had come to town to speak about extending the note on his ranch, a conversation he dreaded more than a winter blizzard. The ranch was all he had left of them, a sprawling, lonely testament to a life that had been stolen from him. "Afternoon, Mr. Miller." Samuel's voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. The young teller, barely a man, looked up from his ledger. "It's Thompson, Mr. Carter. My father is Mr. Miller." Samuel gave a slow nod, the correction barely registering. All the faces in town were starting to blur new ones, replacing the old, a constant reminder of time's relentless march. "Thompson, then. I need to speak with your father about—" The words died in his throat. The cheerful jingle of the bell above the bank's door was followed by a sound that did not belong, the heavy, purposeful thud of spurred boots, too quick, too aggressive for a customer. 3 men filled the doorway, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. The man in the lead was tall and wiry, with eyes that glittered with a cold, cruel amusement. He held a Colt peacemaker with a casual familiarity that spoke of a life lived by its law. "This is a robbery," the leader announced, his voice smooth and laced with a chilling confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, kindly place your hands where I can see them. We're all going to be very reasonable here." The bank's few patrons froze. A woman gasped, clutching her reticule. Samuel's body went rigid, his hand instinctively twitching toward a hip that no longer carried a sidearm. That was a lifetime ago. He was just a rancher now, a ghost. The leader gestured with his pistol toward the teller. "You, son, the cash box. And be quick about it. My patience is as thin as a pauper's blanket." Young Thompson, his face pale and slick with sweat, fumbled with the key. His hands shook so badly that the key scraped uselessly against the lock. I can't." The leader's calm demeanor vanished like a mirage. In 2 long strides, he was at the counter. He vaulted over it with a predatory grace and brought the barrel of his pistol down in a vicious arc. The crack of steel against bone echoed through the silent bank, followed by Thompson's pained cry as he crumpled to the floor. Blood bloomed on his temple. "I said quick," the man hissed. The sound, that sickening thud, was a key turning a lock in the deepest, darkest chamber of Samuel's mind. The world around him dissolved, the scent of dust and fear, replaced by the acrid smell of gunpowder and panicked screams. He was no longer in the Redemption Creek Bank. He was outside a saloon on a sun-scorched street 10 years ago, a deputy's star pinned to his chest. A shootout with the Hollister gang. Bullets tearing through the air, splintering wood, shattering glass. He remembered shouting, ordering his men to hold their fire, but the order was lost in the cacophony. He saw his wife Sarah pulling their 6-year-old son Daniel out of the crossfire, her face a mask of terror. A stray bullet, one of his own men's, had caught her in the side. She had fallen, pulling Daniel down with her, his small body shielding hers. Another shot had followed. 2 lives extinguished by his mistake, his recklessness. He had led the posse. He was responsible. He remembered kneeling in the dust, their blood mingling with the dirt on his hands, the world reduced to a silent, agonizing scream trapped in his chest. He hadn't been able to move. Frozen. Useless. Need a guarantee. The voice of the gang leader pulled Samuel back to the present. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The leader, a man who called himself John Dawson, was dragging someone from the corner where the women had been huddled. It was a young woman, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that Samuel recognized with a soul-deep certainty. It was the same look Sarah had given him in her final moment. John Dawson shoved her forward, his arm clamped around her throat, the muzzle of his Colt pressed against her temple. "Everyone stays put until we're clear," he snarled, backing toward the door. "This is my wife, Claire. And believe me, her life means less to me than the gold in this bag. Don't test me." Claire, his wife. He used her as a human shield, his touch not protective, but proprietary, like a man holding a piece of property. Her terrified gaze swept the room and locked with Samuel's. In her eyes, he saw a plea, a silent scream for help that mirrored the one he had failed to answer a decade ago. Here it was again. The same test. The same chance to act, to do something. But his feet were lead. His limbs were stone. The ghost of his failure had its icy hands wrapped around his heart, squeezing the courage from him. He saw Sarah falling. He saw Daniel's small, still form. He saw the blood on his hands. He could not risk it again. He could not be the cause of another death. Frozen again. John Dawson saw the hesitation, the paralysis that had gripped every man in the room. A cruel smile twisted his lips beneath the bandana. He dragged Claire out into the blinding sunlight, his men following with canvas bags, heavy with stolen hope. Their horses were waiting. Hoofbeats thundered, kicking up a cloud of that ever-present dust. They were gone. Samuel stood in the silent bank, the metallic scent of fresh blood sharp in the air. The teller was groaning, stirring on the floor. The other patrons were weeping, trembling. But all Samuel could see was the ghost of his wife's face superimposed on the terrified features of the woman who had just been taken. He had been given a second chance to face his demon, and he had failed. The weight of his past failure was now compounded by a new one, fresh and raw. Sheriff Miller burst through the doors a moment later, gun drawn, his face grim. "Sam, you all right?" Samuel didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the bank, his movements stiff, mechanical. He strode to his horse, untied the reins with steady hands, and swung himself into the saddle. He didn't look back at the town, at the sheriff, at the life he had tried to build on the ashes of his old one. He looked east toward the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Alkali Flats, where the dust cloud of the escaping riders was already beginning to fade. This time, he would not stay behind. This was not about justice. It was not about the law. It was a debt he owed to the ghosts that rode with him every day. He spurred his horse forward, the quiet rancher fading away, leaving only the man with a reckoning to pay. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the mesas in hues of blood orange and violet as Samuel tracked the gang across the unforgiving Alkali Flats. The heat shimmered above the cracked earth, making the distant buttes dance like phantoms, while the sting of alkali dust clung to the back of his throat. He rode with a singular focus, his world narrowed to the subtle language of the trail. A broken branch here, a scuffed rock there, the distinct print of 4 horses ridden hard. His past as a deputy had taught him the land's secrets, how to read the stories it told in silence. He pushed his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Ghost, relentlessly. He paused only to let the animal drink from his canteen, his own thirst, a distant, unimportant ache. Sleep was a luxury he could not afford. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's terrified face, her eyes pleading her fate tied to his own cowardice. The image was a spur in his gut, driving him onward. He was not tracking John Dawson. He was chasing the specter of his own damnation. 2 days bled into 3. The landscape grew harsher, shifting from cracked earth to jagged canyons and forests of sun-bleached rock. Samuel's supplies dwindled to a handful of jerky and the last of his water. His face was a mask of dust and grim determination. He was an older man, and the chase was taking its toll. His joints ached with a fire that matched the setting sun, but the fire in his soul burned hotter. Late on the 3rd day, he found their camp. It was nestled in a small box canyon concealed by a cluster of boulders. A thin curl of smoke gave them away. Samuel dismounted, tethering Ghost in a thicket of mesquite a safe distance away. He moved on foot now, his worn boots making no sound on the sandy soil. He was a wraith, a thing of shadow and silence. He crept to the edge of the canyon rim, peering down through a tangle of sagebrush. The 3 men were gathered around a small fire. 2 of them were laughing, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth. The 3rd, John Dawson, stood apart, cleaning his pistol with meticulous care. And then Samuel saw her. Claire was tied to a stunted juniper tree, her hands bound in front of her. Her dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with dried tears. There were fresh bruises on her arms, dark blossoms of cruelty against her pale skin. John walked over to her, taking a swig from the whiskey bottle before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Still playing the silent martyr, my dear John's voice was soft, conversational, yet it carried a menace that made Samuel's blood run cold. You should be thanking me. I liberated you from that dusty little town. We have a new life ahead of us. Claire flinched as he reached out and traced the line of her jaw with a dirty finger. She said nothing, her gaze fixed on the fire, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and defiance. Look at me when I speak to you. John snapped his voice, losing its silken edge. He grabbed her chin, forcing her head up. You belong to me. You seem to have forgotten that. Maybe you need a reminder. He looked over at his 2 men, a sly grin spreading across his face. Boys, maybe my wife could use some company. Show her some hospitality. The 2 men chuckled, their eyes glinting with a predatory light as they started to rise. That was it. The breaking point. A cold, clear rage washed over Samuel, extinguishing the last embers of his fear. He was no longer the frozen man in the bank. He was the instrument of a long-overdue reckoning. He moved with a speed that defied his years. He didn't have a plan, only an objective. He circled around the back of the canyon, using the deepening twilight as his cloak. He found a narrow, steep path leading down more of a rock slide than a trail. He descended his hands and feet, finding purchase in the crumbling rock. One of Dawson's men, a burly man with a thick beard, had gotten up to relieve himself near the canyon wall. He was humming a tuneless, drunken song. Samuel emerged from the shadows behind him, a specter of vengeance. He brought the butt of his hunting rifle down on the man's head. The man crumpled without a sound. 1 down. The other 2 were still by the fire. John was whispering something in Claire's ear, his words poisoned with threats. The remaining crony was tossing another piece of wood onto the flames. Samuel moved into the firelight, his rifle leveled. That's far enough, Dawson. Samuel's voice was gravelly. A dead sound in the crackling silence. John spun around, his hand flying to his holstered Colt. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into slits of pure hatred. Well, look at the old ghost of Redemption Creek come to collect another soul. You should have stayed on your ranch, Carter. The world has a way of repeating its lessons. The second man was fumbling for his gun, but he was slow, his mind clouded with whiskey. Samuel didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he staggered back and fell. John had his pistol out now, using Claire as a shield again, pulling her in front of him. The scene was a horrifying echo of the bank robbery. But this time, Samuel was not frozen. His eyes were locked on John, cold and steady. "Let her go, John," Samuel said, his voice dangerously low. "This is between you and me." "Is it?" John laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "I think she's a part of it now. You made her a part of it when you decided to play the hero." He pressed the muzzle of his gun harder against Claire's head. "Drop the rifle, old man, or I'll scatter her brains all over this rock." For a heart-stopping moment, they were at a stalemate. Samuel knew that if he dropped his weapon, they were both dead. He had to create an opportunity. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the fire. "Claire," he said, his voice calm, commanding. "When I move, you drop." He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. He took a half-step to his left, drawing John's aim. Then he lunged, not at John, but at the fire. He kicked the small pile of burning logs, sending a shower of red-hot embers and smoking wood straight at them. John roared in pain and surprise as the embers rained down on him. He flinched, momentarily blinded. In that instant, Claire did as she was told. She dropped to the ground, curling into a ball. The opening was all Samuel needed. He brought the rifle up and fired. The bullet tore through John's gun hand. The Colt clattered to the ground. John screamed a sound of fury and agony, clutching his shattered hand. Samuel was on him in a heartbeat, the butt of his rifle striking John's temple. The charismatic villain fell like a stone, unconscious. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man and the crackle of the scattered fire. Samuel stood over John's still form, his chest heaving. He turned to Claire, who was slowly getting to her feet, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, fragile hope. He walked over to her, and with his hunting knife sawed through the ropes binding her wrists. Her skin was raw and chafed beneath. She rubbed her wrists, her gaze never leaving his face. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel looked from the unconscious form of her husband to the wounded man groaning nearby. He knew it was far from over. This was just the beginning. "For tonight it is," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He helped her to her feet, his touch gentle. "Let's get you home." The journey back was a silent one, marked by the slow, steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Samuel had tied the still unconscious John Dawson over his own saddle, his wounded crony bound, and forced to ride Claire's horse. He had left the first man where he fell, deciding his fate was a matter for the buzzards, not the law. Claire rode ghost, wrapped in Samuel's spare blanket, a small huddled figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. They made camp when the moon was high, a small smokeless fire of dry scrub providing a meager warmth against the desert's chill. Samuel treated the wounded outlaw's shoulder with a crude but effective dressing, his movements economical and devoid of pity. He gave Claire the last of the jerky and a canteen of water, watching as she ate with a slow, deliberate hunger. She hadn't spoken a word since they left the canyon. The trauma she had endured had wrapped her in a cocoon of silence. Samuel sat across the fire from her, cleaning his rifle. The familiar, methodical task a comfort in the unnerving quiet. He watched her from beneath the brim of his hat. He saw the way she flinched when a coyote howled in the distance, the way her hands trembled as she held the canteen. He saw not a fallen woman, but a survivor. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said, his voice quiet, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her eyes, dark pools of exhaustion and fear in the firelight. "Claire," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "You know my name." "I do." He paused, searching for words, a task he always found more difficult than tracking a man across 100 miles of badlands. "He won't hurt you again. I promise." A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. He's made that promise before she said, her voice brittle. The day we were married. The simple, heartbreaking statement hung in the air between them. Samuel had no answer for that kind of pain. He could face down a man with a gun, but the wounds of the heart were a different kind of battlefield. He simply nodded, accepting the weight of her words. He laid his rifle aside and stretched out on his bedroll, pulling his hat over his eyes. "Get some rest," he murmured. "I'll keep watch." He did not sleep. He lay there listening to the sounds of the desert night, his thoughts a maelstrom. He had done it. He had acted. He had faced the demon of his past and had not faltered. But there was no triumph in it, only a deep, weary ache. He had saved her. But what had he saved her for? A life as an outcast, a woman whose husband was a wanted criminal, and the world was not kind to women like Claire. The next day, they reached the borders of his ranch. The sight of the familiar windswept plains and the small, sturdy ranch house in the distance brought a sense of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. This was his sanctuary, the one place the ghosts of his past felt distant. He hoped it could be hers too, at least for a while. He locked John and his man in the sturdy root cellar, a dark, cool space dug into the earth beneath the barn. He would take them to Sheriff Miller in the morning. For now he needed to get Claire inside to a place of warmth and safety. The ranch house was simple and sparse, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. It was a man's home, functional and unadorned. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by a threadbare armchair and a shelf of worn books. The graves of his wife and son were visible from the front window, two simple wooden crosses on a low rise overlooking the valley. Claire stood in the middle of the room looking small and lost. Samuel gestured to a pot of water on the cold stove. "You can wash up. There's a spare room at the back. It's clean." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. While she was gone, he built a fire, the flames chasing the shadows from the corners of the room. He found an old clean shirt of his and a pair of his late wife's trousers folded and preserved in a cedar chest. He left them outside the bedroom door for her, feeling like an intruder in his own memories. When she emerged, the transformation was startling. The dirt was gone, her long dark hair was combed and damp, and she was dressed in the clean clothes. They were too large for her, but they were a shield and armor against the horrors she had left behind. She looked younger, more fragile than he had realized. She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee he had brewed. For the first time, she began to talk. The words tumbled out hesitant at first, then in a torrent of pain and fear. She told him about John, about his silver-tongued courtship that had soured into a possessive, jealous rage. She spoke of the isolation, the fear, the casual cruelty that had become the rhythm of her life. She had run away that day, not because of a single beating, but because she had seen a finality in his eyes, a darkness that promised death. Samuel listened without judgment, his weathered face a stoic mask. He refilled her cup, placed a plate of bread and cheese before her, and let the silence sit comfortably between them when her words ran out. He understood the language of unspoken pain. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her face a canvas of raw vulnerability. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "please don't send me back. If I return to him, he will kill me. He will find a way." Samuel leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He looked at this broken, terrified woman and saw the reflection of his own shattered life. He had brought the storm to her, and now he had brought her into his quiet refuge. He knew that sheltering her meant inviting John Dawson's poison into his world, a world he had so carefully constructed to keep pain at bay. But sending her away was unthinkable. it would be the same as pulling the trigger himself. It would be a failure more profound than the one that had haunted him for a decade. He looked past her out the window to the 2 wooden crosses on the hill. He owed them this. He owed himself this. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a low, unbreakable vow. "No one will send you back. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." For the first time since he'd met her, a fragile, trembling smile touched Claire's lips. It was a small thing, a flicker of light in the profound darkness. But for Samuel, it felt like the dawn. The next morning, Samuel rode into Redemption Creek, leaving Claire with a loaded shotgun and a warning to not open the door for anyone. He led the 2 outlaws, their hands bound their faces, sullen and bruised. The town was just waking up the blacksmith's hammer, providing a steady beat to the new day. When people saw who Samuel had in tow, they stopped and stared. Whispers followed him all the way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a practical, world-weary man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He listened to Samuel's sparse account of the events, his expression unreadable. Bank robbery, kidnapping, assault. "Dawson's bought himself a rope," Miller said, locking the 2 men in a cell. He turned to Samuel, his gaze sharp. "But this ain't gonna be clean, Sam. John Dawson has family in this territory. And his wife. Folks are gonna talk." Miller's words proved prophetic. That same afternoon, Samuel found Claire on the porch, staring out at the empty road, her body trembling. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had come by to drop off a basket of eggs. She hadn't said a word, just left the basket on the bottom step and scurried away as if the ranch were plagued. "She looked at me," Claire whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "Like I was dirt. Like I was the one who did something wrong." The poison had already begun to spread. By the time Samuel rode into town for supplies a few days later, it had infected every corner of Redemption Creek. John Dawson from his cell had been spinning a tale, not of his own villainy, but of his wife's infidelity. He claimed he hadn't robbed the bank out of greed, but in a fit of jealous rage after discovering his beloved Claire in the arms of the reclusive old rancher Samuel Carter. He painted himself as a wronged husband, driven to madness by betrayal. It was a preposterous lie, but it was a story people could understand, a story juicier than a simple robbery. As Samuel walked down the main street, conversations died. Men he'd known for 20 years suddenly found the dust on their boots fascinating. 2 young cowhands muttered "cradle robber" as he passed one of them, spitting contemptuously near his boot. Samuel kept his head high, his face an unreadable mask, but inside a slow-burning anger was building. He had lived with the town's pity and quiet judgment for a decade, a man defined by his tragedy. Now they were trying to define him by a lie, and worse, they were using that lie to crucify a woman who had already been through hell. He found Sheriff Miller in his office, looking more tired than usual. "It's bad," Sam Miller admitted, running a hand over his face. "Dawson's cousin, a lawyer from Prescott, wrote in this morning. He's telling anyone who'll listen that Claire is a known adulteress and you're a homewrecker. He's trying to muddy the waters, turn this into a domestic dispute instead of a federal crime." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. And people are believing it. People will believe whatever story is more interesting. Miller sighed. He leaned forward, his voice low. "I know the truth. You know the truth. But Dawson is smart. He's turning his own wife into the villain. What I need is for her to testify, to stand up in front of a judge and tell her story. The bruises on her arms will speak louder than his lies." Samuel rode back to the ranch with a heavy heart. He found Claire in the barn, trying to mend a leather strap on a saddle. Her hands, unaccustomed to the work, were clumsy, but she was determined. He watched her for a moment, a fierce protectiveness rising in him. She was trying so hard to piece her life back together, and the world was trying just as hard to tear it apart again. He told her what the sheriff had said. The color drained from her face. Testify, she breathed the word catching in her throat. Stand up in front of the whole town and talk about what he did to me. She shook her head, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. I can't. They'll all be staring. They'll be judging me. John will be there. I can't face him. Claire Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. It's the only way. The only way to make the truth stick. The only way to be free of him for good. I'm not strong enough, she whispered, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Samuel stepped closer and put a hand on her shoulder. You are, he said, his voice a low rumble of conviction. You survived him. You survived the desert. You are stronger than you know. He paused, his gaze unwavering. You won't be alone. I'll be there right beside you. That night, as Claire lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep was a distant shore. The thought of facing a courtroom filled with hostile, whispering faces was a nightmare. She got up and began to pace her fear, a physical weight in her chest. Needing something, anything to distract her, she began to tidy the main room. She found one of John's saddlebags, which Samuel had brought back from the canyon, tossed in a corner. An irrational anger surged through her. She wanted to burn it, to destroy every last trace of him. She grabbed the bag and took it outside, intending to throw it on the dying embers of the cook fire. But as she held it, a strange curiosity took hold. She opened the flap and emptied its contents onto the porch. A few spare rounds, a half-empty flask, a tarnished silver dollar. And at the bottom, a small oilskin-wrapped package. Her fingers, trembling slightly, unwrapped it. Inside was a faded photograph, its corners soft with age. It showed two young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a much younger John, his face unlined by cruelty. The other man was a stranger with kind eyes and a wide-open smile. There was a powerful resemblance between them. They had to be brothers. She had never known John had a brother. He had always claimed to be an only child, a man who had made his own way in the world alone. Another lie. Her entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. She slipped the photograph into the pocket of her trousers, a cold unease settling in her stomach. It was just a picture, but it felt like a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. The next day, Samuel found her in the barn holding the photo. Do you know this man? She asked, her voice small. He took the photo, his brow furrowed. He studied the stranger's face, a flicker of something distant and painful in his eyes. No, he said, handing it back. Can't say I do. But later that day, as he rode to meet with Sheriff Miller to discuss the trial, the face in the photograph gnawed at him. It was familiar, a ghost from a past he tried never to revisit. Miller was waiting for him, his face grim. Dawson's lawyer is petitioning to have the trial moved, the sheriff said without preamble. Claims there's too much prejudice against his client here. That's because he's guilty, Samuel stated flatly. Maybe, Miller said, stroking his mustache. But there's something else. I've been digging into John Dawson's past. Turns out he wasn't always John Dawson. He was born John Bennett. He had an older brother, Thomas Bennett. The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Thomas Bennett, the homesteader. The kind eyes and wide smile from the photograph snapped into focus. 10 years ago, the shootout with the Hollister gang. The Bennett farm tragedy. Samuel whispered the words, tasting like ash. Miller nodded slowly, his eyes full of a sad understanding. The crossfire. Your posse. Thomas Bennett was killed. An innocent man caught in the middle. It was what made you turn in your badge, Sam. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. John Dawson was John Bennett. His cruelty wasn't random. His appearance in Redemption Creek wasn't a coincidence. Claire's family ranch bordered the old abandoned Bennett homestead. He had married her, endured the marriage for years, all as part of a long, patient, and terrible plan. It wasn't about money. It was about revenge. It's all been for me, Samuel said, his voice hollow. The robbery, the kidnapping, the lies, they were all arrows aimed at his heart. He had thought he was saving a stranger, but he had been walking into a trap that had been set for him a decade ago. A sudden, violent clap of thunder rattled the windows of the sheriff's office. The sky outside had turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A dust storm was rolling in from the plains, a monstrous, churning wall of dirt that promised to swallow the world. And Samuel knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that John Bennett, was not going to wait for a trial. The storm was coming, and the final bloody act of his revenge was about to begin. He had to get back to Claire. He burst out of the office and ran for his horse, the first stinging grains of sand already whipping at his face. The wind howled like a vengeful spirit, and in its cry, Samuel Carter heard the name of his sin, Bennett. The ride back to the ranch was a battle against the elements. The wind tore at Samuel, a physical force that tried to rip him from the saddle. Dust filled the air, a thick, blinding curtain that reduced visibility to a few feet and scoured the skin like a rasp. Ghost, his buckskin, fought the reins, his eyes wide with animal panic. Samuel leaned low, his hat pulled down his bandana, pulled up, his world reduced to a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging sand. He wasn't just fighting the storm. He was fighting the sickening realization that churned in his gut. Every step of this tragedy had been orchestrated. John Bennett had woven a web of deceit and pain, and he and Claire were caught at its center. He had married her, not for love, but for proximity. He had abused her, not just out of jealousy, but to break a woman living on land that bordered his family's tragedy. The bank robbery was a performance, a public spectacle designed to draw Samuel in, to force him to relive his greatest failure before destroying him completely. He burst into the ranch yard just as the full fury of the storm hit. The sky was black. The barn, only 50 yards away, was a faint, ghostly outline. He threw open the door to the house, shouting Claire's name over the roar of the wind. She was there, standing by the window, the shotgun in her hands. She had seen the storm coming. Fear was etched on her face, but there was something else there too, a hardened resolve. He escaped, Samuel said, the words torn from his lips by the wind. The storm must have been his cover. Miller's deputy is down. Dawson is gone. He didn't need to say more. They both knew where he was coming. Bar the door, he commanded, moving to the windows, pulling the heavy wooden shutters closed, and dropping the thick iron bars into place. The house was plunged into a dim, dusty twilight, and the roar of the storm now, a muffled, terrifying thunder outside. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. The cellar, Claire said, her voice tight. The weapons are in the cellar. No, Samuel countered, his mind racing. He'll expect us to hole up in here. He'll burn us out. The barn, it's built of stone and thick timber. It's defensible. It was a grim calculus of survival. He grabbed his spare rifle from the wall mount and a box of cartridges. Stay close to me. They ran from the house to the barn, the wind nearly tearing them from their feet. Sand blasted their faces, 1,000 tiny needles. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and animals, the storm a deafening roar on the timber roof. Samuel barred the heavy main doors. The only light came from a single grimy window high in the loft. He led Claire to the stalls at the back. "Stay down," he ordered, handing her his pistol. "You know how to use this." She nodded her hands, surprisingly steady, as she took the heavy weapon. "Just point and pull the trigger. Don't shoot until you see him, and don't miss." He took up a position behind a stack of hay bales, his rifle resting on the top pointed at the main doors. And then they waited. The waiting was the worst part. The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos. Every creak of the old barn, every rattle of the tin roof was the sound of approaching death. Samuel's mind was a torrent of guilt and regret. He had brought this on her. His past was a ravenous beast, and it had come to devour them both. He looked over at Claire, huddled in the shadows of the stall. Her face was pale, but her eyes were focused, her jaw set. She was no longer the trembling victim he had found in the desert. The fire that had forged her survival was now burning bright. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost its meaning in the dark, roaring heart of the storm. Then a sound different from the wind, a splintering crash from the side of the barn. John hadn't come through the front door. He had used an axe on the weaker planks of the side wall. A moment later, a figure scrambled through the jagged hole. It was John Bennett. His face was a demonic mask of fury and triumph, his eyes wild in the gloom. In his uninjured hand, he held a lantern. "Evening, Carter," he bellowed over the wind, his voice cracking with madness. "I was beginning to think you weren't going to welcome me home." Samuel had his rifle trained on John's chest. "It's over, Bennett. Drop the lantern." John laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Over, it's just getting started. This is the final lesson, the one where you learn that every action has a consequence." He took a step forward, raising the lantern. "You took my brother from me. You with your arrogance and your tin star. You played God that day, and an innocent man paid the price. So I took something from you. I took your peace. I took your solitude." He gestured toward Claire with the lantern. "And I took her. Did you know, Carter? Did she ever tell you she knew? She knew all about my brother." Samuel's blood ran cold. He glanced at Claire. Her face was a mask of confusion and horror. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Am I?" John sneered, his eyes glittering. "Tell him, Claire. Tell him how you found the old photograph. Tell him how you asked me about it. I told you he was a homesteader killed by a reckless deputy. I told you his name was Thomas Bennett. You knew who Carter was. You knew what he did. And you stayed silent." The secondary twist was a knife in Samuel's heart. He looked at Claire, a terrible doubt blooming in his mind. Had she been a part of this willing, or at least knowing, participant in his torment? Claire's face crumpled, but then her fear hardened into a fierce, defiant anger. "Yes," I knew she cried out, her voice ringing with a strength he had never heard before. "I knew your brother was dead. You told me he died in an accident. You never told me you were planning. You used his memory just like you used me. You're a monster, John, and you hide behind your brother's grave." Her words were a balm on Samuel's wounded soul. The truth, raw and painful, had cleared the air. He saw it now. She was as much a victim of John's twisted grief as he was. "You see, Carter," John screamed, his face contorted with rage. "She chose you another betrayal." He took another step, holding the lantern high over a pile of dry hay. "So now you have to choose. A real choice this time. Not like the one you had in the bank. You can save the woman who lied to you, or you can save the last thing your family ever built." He dropped the lantern. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, consuming the dry hay in an instant. Black smoke billowed toward the rafters. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking up the wooden walls of the stalls, turning their sanctuary into a death trap. The choice was a lie. John didn't want him to choose. He wanted them both to die, to be consumed by the fire of his hatred. "Claire, the loft," Samuel yelled over the crackling roar. A ladder led up to the hayloft, and from there, a large door used for loading hay opened out into the storm. It was their only way out. But John was blocking the path, his face illuminated by the growing inferno, a devil in his own private hell. He drew a knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. This was the moment, the culmination of a decade of grief and guilt. Samuel fired his rifle not at John, but at the heavy block and tackle hanging from the main beam above him. The bullet splintered the wood of the mounting bracket. At the same instant, Claire acted. The horses, panicking from the smoke and flames, were kicking wildly in their stalls. With a cry of desperate courage, she unlatched the nearest stall door. A massive draft horse, its eyes rolling in terror, burst out, charging blindly away from the fire and straight toward John. John spun surprised just as the horse slammed into him. He was thrown sideways, his head striking a wooden post with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground, stunned. At the same moment, the damaged block and tackle gave way. The heavy iron hook and thick ropes plunged downward, landing in a heap on the very spot where John had been standing moments before. The path was clear. "Go," Samuel yelled. He grabbed Claire's hand, and they scrambled up the ladder to the loft, the heat of the fire scorching their backs. Smoke choked the air, making every breath a painful, searing gasp. Samuel shoved the heavy loft door open. The wind and sand blasted in, a welcome if violent reprieve from the suffocating smoke. They climbed out onto the small wooden ledge. The ground was a 12-foot drop below. Without hesitating, Samuel jumped, landing hard, his ankle twisting beneath him. A sharp, white-hot pain shot up his leg, but he ignored it. He looked up, holding out his arms. "Jump, Claire, I'll catch you." She jumped. He caught her, his body absorbing the impact, and they tumbled together into the muddy, windswept yard. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the roar of the fire competing with the roar of the storm. The barn was an inferno, a funeral pyre for John Bennett's rage and Samuel Carter's past. As the storm began to break, its fury spent, the first red glow of dawn was mirrored by the angry red glow of the burning barn. Figures on horseback appeared through the receding curtain of dust. It was Sheriff Miller and a posse drawn by the fire. Samuel pushed himself to his feet, leaning on Claire for support. He was wounded, exhausted, and his home was a smoking ruin. But as he looked at the woman standing beside him, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear and strong, he felt something he hadn't felt in 10 years. He felt free. The debt was paid. The months that followed were a time of quiet rebuilding, both of the ranch and of their lives. John Bennett had not died in the fire. The posse had dragged his unconscious form from the burning barn. His trial was swift. With Claire's powerful, unwavering testimony and the evidence of his crimes, he was sentenced to hang. His reign of terror was finally truly over. The town of Redemption Creek, humbled by the truth, saw Samuel Carter in a new light. He was no longer the town ghost, the tragic recluse. He was the man who had faced down a monster, the man who had stood for a woman when no one else would. Offers of help to rebuild the barn came from all corners. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now met his with respect. Claire stayed. The ranch became her home, not as a refugee, but as a partner. She worked alongside Samuel, her hands growing as calloused as his, her laughter becoming a familiar sound that chased the lingering loneliness from the corners of the house. She learned to mend fences, to handle a horse, to read the sky for signs of rain. She was not the woman he had found broken in the desert. She was a woman remade, forged in the fires of adversity into something strong and resilient. One cool autumn afternoon, months later, Samuel took a newly carved stone marker out to the low rise overlooking the valley. He pulled the two weathered wooden crosses from the earth, the wood soft and worn from a decade of sun and snow. He set the stone in their place. It was simple, elegant granite, and on it were carved three names: Sarah Carter, Daniel Carter, and at the bottom in smaller letters, Thomas Bennett. It was an act of forgiveness, an acknowledgement that all three were victims of a cycle of violence he was determined to end. As he stood back, his hand resting on the cool stone, Claire came and stood beside him. She said nothing, simply placed a single bright yellow wildflower at the base of the marker. The gesture was a quiet promise, a symbol of new life growing from the soil of old sorrows. Samuel looked from the grave to the woman beside him, her presence a steady, comforting warmth against the crisp air. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying not the ghosts of the past, but the promise of a future. In a wide and lonely land, two souls broken in different ways had found not just shelter, but a shared strength. They had found a quiet, unassuming thing that looked a great deal like hope.